Greetings. Brian Jenks, weed scientist, North Dakota State University, here to discuss weed issues in canola. Okay, so my understanding is the majority of the canola in North Dakota is Liberty Link canola. And we know that Liberty, in order to be effective, needs to be applied with AMS. Some labels differ, 22 ounces depending on the use. Maximum in crop total 58 fluid ounces, maximum season 87. Can be applied pre-plant or pre, but we prefer not to. We just don't want to put that much selection pressure on Liberty. Obviously, we know the effect of the environment on Liberty, the effectiveness of it. It needs sun, heat, humidity to make Liberty much more effective. What about Liberty and grasses? Liberty by itself can be a little bit weaker on grasses, especially larger grasses, and so in those cases we will typically apply Liberty with Select. Okay, what I want to discuss now is the concept of Liberty, how we use it, and how we're going to preserve it. Because right now, with most of the canola being Liberty Link canola, we are putting a lot of selection pressure on Liberty. We know we've got issues with certain weeds like water hemp and kochia, and we use and we rely on Liberty so much to control kochia especially. And if we're using canola or we're planting canola every other year, we're putting a lot of selection pressure on Liberty. And just to take kochia for example, in a 2-year rotation, if we use wheat and then we're using starring in the wheat and we're using Liberty in the Liberty canola, we have 2 crop groups that we are using. And if we continue to use this 2-year crop rotation, all our selection pressure is going on starring and Liberty. We know that some kochia is already somewhat tolerant to starring, and if we're using Liberty every other year in canola, that's going to be a lot of selection pressure. Now also, if we're relying on Liberty to control kochia in soybeans, that's even more selection pressure. So I ask you to consider, how many effective modes of action do you have in your crop rotation? In this case we have 2, crop 4 and group 4 and group 10. I also ask you, how long are these modes of action going to last? Some of our modes of action have lasted maybe 10 years, some longer, but we really need to consider how we can preserve these modes of action so that we have them for years to come. You also want to consider, how will your son or daughter control weeds in the future when they take over the farm? Okay, so if we go with a 3-year rotation, wheat, soybean, canola, if we're using only post-emergence products like starring and Liberty, again, that's a lot of selection pressure on those 2 modes of action. If we switch it up a little bit and we go wheat, soybean, wheat, canola, that might be a little bit better from a crop rotation standpoint, but still we're only using 2 modes of action. That's a lot of stress on those 2 herbicides. How about if we consider something different? For example, in wheat, if we consider using more than 1 mode of action, say here we've got a product starring plus bromoxynil. We have many different products that contain starring and bromoxynil, and that gives us 2 modes of action, crop group 4 and group 6. Liberty canola, what if we use Sonalan instead of just Liberty? So maybe put down Sonalan, which is a group 3, Liberty come back post, group 10. That takes some selection pressure off of Liberty. Sonalan controls some of the weeds, Liberty controls what's left. In wheat, could use something like Husky FX, which has 3 modes of action. In the next year, Liberty Link soybean, instead of relying on total post, with Liberty we could use something like Spartan and Metribuzin to control weeds before they emerge. Could come back with a different mode of action, something like Flexstar, Ultra Blazer, even Basagran. So instead of having 2 modes of action, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 7 modes of action here. And for kochia, we know that this Group 14 Flexstar controls some of the resistant kochia that we have. So instead of having 2 modes of action here, we've got at least 7 modes of action to control kochia, and as well as other weeds. And I really think that's something you need to consider. Okay, so we know that kochia isn't our only weed to control. Roundup definitely helps us to control other weeds, including grasses. If you're struggling with weeds like green foxtail and wild oat, as well as some other broadleaf weeds, obviously Roundup can still help us. And so we've got Roundup Ready varieties, we've got the TrueFlex varieties where we can apply different amounts. Obviously the TrueFlex varieties will handle or tolerate a little bit more Roundup, and so we can apply a little bit more Roundup in those TrueFlex varieties. The stacked trait varieties, Roundup plus Liberty, that gives us an opportunity to spray something like Liberty in one pass and Roundup in the next, or vice versa. Personally, I would prefer Liberty maybe in the first pass, where the weeds are a little bit smaller, but you can decide on which way you want to go with that. Maybe some of the cons is the Roundup Ready Volunteers. You won't be able to control the Roundup Ready Volunteers with just a Roundup. Some weaknesses of Roundup, of course, Roundup resistant kochia, horseweed, mallow, wild buckwheat. Roundup does have some weaknesses there. What are the weaknesses of Liberty? Grasses, especially the larger ones, lamb's quarters, some larger broadleaf weeds. When we get some low sunlight, low humidity, low temperatures, Liberty doesn't work near as well. But having those 2 options can be an advantage. How do we control canola volunteers? You can refer to page 113 in the weed guide. There's ratings for several different herbicides in different crops. We know that canola is much more easily controlled when it's less than 4 leaf. So if you can control that canola when it's 2 to 4 leaf, it's a lot easier to control than when it's bolting. In wheat, we have many products that will control volunteer canola. In soybean, have several products, including residual products like Valor, Metribuzin, some post products, Roundup. If you're using Roundup, Roundup will control Liberty Volunteers, and Liberty will control Roundup Volunteers, Flexstar, Raptor. These provide very good control of Roundup Ready or Canola Volunteers. Need to mention and remind you that Spartan does not control volunteer canola. If you're no-till, our products that are labeled for burn down in front of canola, glyphosate, AIM, Vita, Gramoxone, Liberty. Again, don't really want to use Liberty in a burn down if we don't have to. Unfortunately, sometimes we run into some glyphosate resistant weeds. Now seeing some AIM resistant kochia, Vita resistant kochia. So sometimes Gramoxone may be our only option. Obviously, wheat canola growers are also wheat growers, and just another reminder to use products in your wheat that have at least 2 effective modes of action on kochia. Again, styrene, bromoxynil. There are several products that contain styrene and bromoxynil. Husky FX has 3 modes of action. Talinor, if you tank mix it with styrene, we would also be looking at 3 modes of action. Just looking at some rotation restrictions, if you use Husky FX in your wheat, canola, it's only a 9-month rotation restriction. If you're rotating to lentil, that's the only issue with Husky FX, 18 months going to lentil. Talinor, these crop rotations vary by rate and county. With canola, we're primarily in that 9 to 10 month rotation range, so we should be good generally with rotating to canola after using Telenor. So just some miscellaneous things to consider. Again, short rotations. If we're using real short rotations, we're putting a lot of selection pressure on products like Liberty that we've got to preserve so that we have Liberty to use in 20, 30 years. If we go with short rotations using Liberty every other year, that's going to put too much selection pressure on. We should be trying to use Liberty no more than every 3, preferably every 4 years. And just some previous experience. Several years ago, we found that in some cases, it might only take 7 to 9 years for resistance to develop if we've been using the same herbicides over and over in short rotations. Something like a wheat soybean rotation using wide match in the wheat, Liberty in the canola, and so on. So we know that we've got Roundup resistant kochia is very common. We're starting to see group 14 resistance in some areas, and so we've got to do whatever we can to preserve Liberty, because if we lose Liberty like we've lost Roundup, we're not going to have any post-emergence options. So again, I would ask you to consider going back and using some Sonalan. I know I'm talking to some growers that are conventional till. You could incorporate these with tillage or rainfall if you can time it just right. For those in no-till, you could be putting it on in the fall. If you're growing soybeans and you're using metribuzin, keep in mind there is an 18-month rotation restriction to canola. Metribuzin can be used in soybean, peas, and lentils. So just keep that in mind, that 18-month rotation restriction to canola. Considering some other tough weeds that we occasionally run into, marsh elder is maybe a little bit more common in the central part of the state and further east. The marsh elder can be controlled with Roundup, Liberty, and Stinger. Common ragweed, certainly more common in the east, and sometimes we run into glyphosate-resistant ragweed. In that case, Liberty and Stinger are generally effective. Obviously, Canada thistle, our best treatments are Roundup and Stinger. Wild oat, our best option would be a Roundup application or a Liberty plus Select full rate prior to tillering. Usually with wild oat, the smaller it is, the easier it is to control. Thank you for listening. I hope this information has been beneficial. If you do need to contact me, here's my email and phone number. More than willing to discuss this with anyone, and I hope you have a great year in 2024. Thank you.